Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything, from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal.
Okay. If anybody else wants to come with me, this moment will be the moment of something real and fun and inspiring in this God-forsaken business, and we will do it together. Who's coming with me? Who's coming with me? Who's coming with me? Who's coming with me besides Flipper here? This is embarrassing.
All right, everybody. Today we're going to kick off our 4-part series on our journey of starting a company and kind of what we think it takes to build a small business, grow it, survive recessions, pandemics, and personal tragedy as we kind of moved along this journey. And we still love it most days. But that was a clip from Jerry Maguire and one of my favorite movies of him saying, "That's it. I'm done. I'm walking out of the office. I'm starting my business. And who wants to come with me?" And to some extent, that's what building a business feels like on that first week when you decide that you're no longer going to seek out a job and you're going to try to build your own path. So good morning, D. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. We've got an interesting kind of story to tell, I guess. I don't think there's too many people who are quite like us.
No, I don't think so. I think the reason why this feels right to kind of do this, and we're not going to do the 4-part series like in order. We'll just drop them in as we kind of move along because it takes a lot of kind of thinking on our part about, some of our old stories and stuff like that, about what it took to kind of get to the point where you're kind of autonomously running your own thing. Is that a lot of people that I talk to, especially people in tech, seem to be kind of, I don't know, burned out or tired. And they always say the same thing to me, which is, I wish I can start my own thing, control my own schedule, control my own destiny. It's always that kind of that same kind of mantra or like idea. And it doesn't come without a lot of pain, but also a lot of fun times and a lot of journeys and things like that. And so we thought it'd be a good idea to kind of break it apart and kind of tell you what it was like to do it, how we got to where we are, and kind of what happened along the way. It was interesting because we knew we were going to record this podcast today, and it'll post on Monday. Today is middle of the week, and I happened to run across an old picture of myself and Demetrius and a bunch of our old colleagues all sitting on the top of a tank. And it was in 2005. And it was basically the first real contract that our company had. Dee and I had started the company, and then we were trying to kind of figure out, how do you set up a business arrangement where like someone hires you to help complete one of their goals, but you kind of control everything because it's your company. And this was the first time. And we were able to do this because a good friend of ours who brought us along a lot of his journeys over the years that we were running this business said, "Hey, yeah, I want you to come work with us on this cool project with the U.S. military. And I think we can make it work for what you guys want to do and how you want to do it." And so he kind of guided us on that process. And it was really exciting. But I want to kind of start from the beginning. So one of the things that I would say is that when Dee and I were starting our career, we both worked at NASA. And we were at NASA because of a partnership with the university that we went to, San Jose State University, where we would work 3 days a week, sometimes 4 days a week, and we would support research labs at NASA. And then during the daytime, when we had classes, we were allowed to leave, go to our classes, and then the evenings we can stay and work on our homework there. And it was just a really great environment that put us in a position to learn a lot, but also have the opportunity to kind of think, kind of bigger, like what do we want to do with our lives? And we were kind of coming to the end of the NASA contract, and things were changing in the administration. I think George Bush was in office and wanted to focus more on applied research rather than basic research, which is what we were doing. And Dee and I just kind of looked at each other and were like, we both want to go on a journey. Is that what? Do you remember that time, Dee? Like, do you remember what you were thinking during that time before we started Metric Lab?
Yeah, I felt as though like a lot of the things that I'd wanted to do before that were a little bit more in academia and stuff. And I think this was a time in which I was feeling a bit disillusioned towards kind of what life was like within academia and like how much you had to kind of slave away for a while before you can even make like decent money. I remember talking to professors back then and saying like, oh, when you first get hired as a professor, you're looking at like pay within the 30K range, right? So it was just like you were dependent on getting grants in order to kind of pay yourself, in order to supplement, in order to have any kind of living and stuff. And then like there's all this politics that are involved, and it was just something that was like, all right, well, I'm realizing I don't necessarily want to do that,
Yeah.
and let's see what else is out there.
Yeah. So, but at that, I mean, that's essentially kind of like running a business, really, when it comes to grant writing. I mean, we met a lot of those
Mhm.
professors, and it's like there's, up day and night writing these grants, trying to influence these organizations to fund their research for, 6 months, year, 5 years, 10 years, so that they can do the work that they really want to do, that they believe in. Let me ask you, though, what was it that made you think about wanting to get into academia, though? Like, what was exciting about it?
Well, I think I was always very interested in kind of like basically answering questions, solving problems, like this contributing knowledge where it hadn't existed before. So one of the interesting things about that time was that, yeah, UX and kind of the research side of things was kind of in its infancy. There was kind of usability had existed for a while, but like a lot of the deeper stuff were just kind of getting off the ground. Like not a lot of people were doing ethnography. Not a lot of people were doing the generative stuff. There was like the old focus groups and survey stuff that people still do, which we will talk about at some point how much their application is kind of limited, and you should be very careful with that kind of data because it's not super reliable. But like what we do now didn't really exist within the tech industry at the time.
Yeah, I mean, we were doing human factors research, though. I mean, we were on that
Yeah.
side of it with NASA, right? Human factors and ergonomics, and San Jose State, I think, was one of the only schools in the country that offered a graduate degree in human factors and kind of aeronautics and kind of that whole space area, so that you can work with NASA and work with like airplane manufacturers and just different things like that. But you're right, it was just beginning, and you and I didn't even know that it was just beginning. Like
Yeah.
we were talking to companies a little bit that friends had worked with, like Frog Design and things. I think one of them was what was the bigger one that our friend from NASA went to for a little bit?
Uh, there was Frog, there was Method, there was Adaptive Path, there was
Adaptive Path.
IDEO,
That was it.
there
Yeah.
was
So
Jump.
yeah, yeah. So there was quite a few at the time, and I think the idea was is that if you kind of get out of your own way, right? So if a company could
Mhm.
just step back and have one of these firms come in and basically think about the problem from a different perspective, conduct research, meet with people, do those types of things, that you can kind of grow in a much larger way. You can kind of create a new narrative basically for your company, and that was just starting to really get a grip on things. I mean, Frog had been around for a long time because they supported Apple and the development of their products
Yeah, I
and,
think
and, and
IDEO and Frog were some of the really early ones.
yeah, so we saw some of this happening. And I mean, I know for like myself, like I originally thought I wanted to work at the behavioral science unit at the FBI because I had heard all about it. This is an interesting story. It might help people a little bit when it comes to figuring out what you want to do, is that you really got to go test the waters a little bit. So I had done computer repair in high school. I worked at CompUSA, and we had a great time. I repaired computers, and one of the customers we had was the FBI in San Francisco, and so I'd gone over there and set up some computers for them, and got to see what the offices look like, and it seemed kind of cool. And then when I was thinking about joining the FBI and trying to do like the behavioral science unit and all that, I had this like glamorous, I think, idea of what that would look like. And then someone gave me the phone number of an FBI agent and said, "Oh, you can call him and ask him what his life is like." And I actually called him from my NASA office, and I just said, like, "Hey, how's it going? Like, someone gave me your phone number. We've never met. I just wanted to ask you some questions about what life is like." And when he described what it would take, basically, to get to where I wanted to go, which was, by the way, the tiniest unit. The behavioral science unit is not like the biggest unit of, maybe it is now, but it
Yeah.
wasn't back then. It was this tiny little unit, right? You'd have to have like a PhD, be the best in the world, and everybody wants you. And then work your way in there and stuff like that, which is possible, but it just seemed far off. But anyways, he described his life, and his life, to be honest, sounded pretty rough. And
Yeah.
he sounded depressed, and he didn't sound super stoked. And so he explained everything to me about what it would take. And I got off the call and I was like, you know what? I don't want to go down this path. I don't want to spend the next decade of my life fighting for a position in order to conduct research and work on interesting projects and kind of like tell big stories and be a business owner and stuff like that. And prior to that, I had started multiple businesses in high school in computer repair and other things. And I loved the autonomy of it. It was
Hmm.
very cool. But I didn't know I was going to start a business yet because I was still at NASA, and Demetrius and I were still doing research projects at the university, and we were figuring things out. Um, and then one day, someone introduced me to the owner of a consultancy in San Francisco. And I don't know if you remember this, D. And I drove up to San Francisco. This is so funny. This was before Google Maps, any of those things. I had printed out a MapQuest map
Hmm. Yeah.
on paper. And then I went into the city, and the city was so foggy. I couldn't see 6 feet in front of me driving. Like, it was insanely freaky. So I'm driving around. I can't see the streets very well. I didn't know what to do. So I pulled over on the side of the road and I called my friend Eric. And Eric still lives in San Francisco. And I said, Eric, I think I'm lost. I have no idea where I'm going. Like, I'm looking at the MapQuest. I can't see the signs. And he like guided me on my phone, on my BlackBerry, um, down the streets and over to this person's house. And they lived in this big, beautiful home overlooking the ocean. It was amazing. And they were working at this consultancy, and they said, "Oh, you can help us out with some of these projects." And they were communication-based research projects and like organizational management stuff. And they had big clients like Google and stuff like that. And I was like, "Oh, this is interesting." So we get in. They were awesome. They were super nice and all this kind of stuff. But what I quickly realized was that like I wasn't going to be able to really like take everything in my head and apply it. Like, they didn't really want me touching their customer. It was more like I helped them and then they helped the customer,
Hmm.
because it took them forever to like land these large customers, and they don't want just some kid that they don't know applying his thinking to a customer that, took years to establish or build a reputation. Right. And I remember feeling frustrated because I was like, oh, I can't really do much. And they don't really like the way I write stuff. I write in a more, academic way or whatever it is, more research
At the
oriented way.
time, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so at the time, I remember coming back, and I think you and I were living together at the time. Um, or maybe we weren't, but like, I remember coming to you and saying like at NASA, I was like, once this is over, why don't we start our own company? Like, we're just as smart as these people. We're just as smart as everybody else. Why don't we just start our own company, go get our own clients, and then we can work with all these different companies and have these amazing experiences and work on all kinds of different things. And that's how I remember it starting, honestly. Like, do you remember it starting that way? I mean, and there's many angles that pushed us in this direction, but like, do you remember that conversation?
Yeah, I do. I think at the time, I mean, we weren't even really thinking about getting into tech per se. We'd both kind
No.
of like, we grew up in Silicon Valley. You had worked in tech prior to that. You had
Yeah.
been like at a Turbo Linux doing, I think, network engineering.
Yep. Yeah.
Uh,
Network and desktop support and stuff like that. Working at a startup company, and it was fun. It was really fun.
yeah. I mean, grown up in Silicon Valley. I had, my mom and my aunts and uncles and stuff had worked in tech. I had not at that point in time. I had been, worked in mostly, like, I worked in a public library for a while, then I worked at NASA, and I had been going to school. But that had kind of been it. And I think at that initial point, we weren't even necessarily thinking about kind of doing the work that we do now. That didn't come until we were a year or two into it.
Yeah.
Um, so it was kind of like, all right, I will go along with you with the ride and see what happens, because I knew it's one of the things I'd tell people is like, you know what, you're never going to know what you want to do until you actually try it and see what
100%.
it feels like. You're kind of speculating like, oh, if I go do this, I'm going to really like it. But a lot of times you get into it and maybe you won't. So my advice when I talk to young people who are starting out in their career, or even people who are a little bit older who might be thinking about changing careers, is like, you know what? It's okay to change your mind. That's kind of the part of the process. Is just, you know what, go out there, get actual experience doing it, see what it feels like, and just be ready to change your mind. And if you need to change your mind, you can. So that was kind of my thought process at the time. I was like, all right, you know what? Brian's really passionate about this. I don't know what this is or what it's going to lead to necessarily, but I'm willing to give it a shot. And if I need to change my mind and go another direction, I can. And we kind of did with our company. Our company's kind of changed direction a few times. It's
Sure.
one
I
of
mean,
the things that
when
I don't think you can do as much within a company and at a job is actually change the direction you're going.
Yeah, I mean, pivoting is everything, right? Because like when we first started the business, we were like, let's focus on conducting research in the space of communication because we were doing so much work in that area, and we were kind of becoming known as the guys who really understand this stuff. You know, we were published authors in this area, and we had read every research journal article that's ever been written about communication pattern analysis and studying
Yeah.
how people communicate and talk and all stuff. And I remember we even did a talk at the university where we had like a poster talk, put a poster up. And I remember this guy came over and he was like a judge. And he was a judge. He was like a local judge. And he said, if you look at what you guys are doing here, you can like track the communication of like lawyers and how lawyers are communicating with one another and communicating with their clients. And you could probably tell stories about that. And I wonder if that's helpful for lawyers. And like people were like dropping all kinds of interesting um, just ideas in our plate because of the work that we were doing. And so we kind of were more or less following that avenue rather than
Mhm.
following the avenue of like, oh, I just want to go, go work with Microsoft or go work with Google, amazing clients. But like we weren't thinking that because that felt like that's in our backyard. But this other thing was like different, and maybe different would be more exciting at the time. Um, what we quickly realize is like different also means niche, and niche sometimes means really hard to find clients. But
Yeah.
when our friend, I don't mention names just because I don't know if they want to be heard on here, but like our friend helped us land our first kind of contract with this military project. His thing to me is like, hey, you guys know how to conduct research really well. You've worked at NASA, you've worked in labs. We're
Mhm.
trying to make things safer for all these soldiers, and we get to study all these different categories and all these different ways, and then apply them and everything. And I was like, hey, that sounds amazing. It's right down our alley.
Yeah.
Next thing I know, you and I are in the middle of the desert, like testing things out, right? So uh, it led down the right path, but it had a lot of twists and turns and pivots in it. And I think that's one of the big lessons for people is that like your idea on paper, and we wrote business plans too. Dean and I wrote down like, oh, here's our business plan. We wrote it out and it like changed so much that we stopped doing it. But like
Yeah.
the big thing is like you have to be okay with just constantly changing and realizing that every time you change, you're starting over.
Yeah, one of the things I think early on was very focused on human factors, and I think
Yeah.
it's important to kind of understand a little bit of the difference between human factors and user experience. With human factors is really focused on kind of what are human beings capable of, especially from a psychological, mental, cognitive standpoint. So there were a lot of early research studies that were like, all right, well, how many numbers can a human being remember?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that was used. I mean, that was a long, long time ago. That was well before I think we were even like old enough to go to college. That's where the phone numbers came from, where they did the research and found, okay, they can reliably remember 7 numbers and then maybe the extra 3 for an area code. So that's why those phone numbers are the length that they are. And then there were things like, if you want to use different colors in your interface, like if you want to color code your buttons for your controls or if you want to use different sounds for different things, then like how different should they be? Like how different does a shade of color need to be measured in nanometers of light before somebody can distinguish between, okay, that's orange red and that's a red orange, that kind of stuff. So a lot of it was that, especially back then we were working on, you were working in audio, I was working in kind of virtual environments. So a lot of my stuff was like head tracking and how can people like how quickly does the screen need to refresh and stuff. You were doing things like, all right, well, how if we're going to localize sounds in space, how far apart do they need to be from each other for most people to be able to tell the difference and that they're not coming from the same direction. And that has a lot of human factors. It's very nuts and bolts, very what's called psychophysics, which is like the kind of like that kind of just noticeable difference kind of stuff where you're like looking at like almost biological levels of things. And user experience is much more about preferences and desires and a little bit more of that deeper psychological driven thing. So not just what can people do, but what do they want to do? What drives them? What interests them? Like, where does their attention go? Because that's where they want it to go.
Yeah, and actually, it felt lighter, even though now it doesn't.
Hmm.
It feels way denser and much more difficult to some extent, because like with the NASA stuff, it was a very concrete thing, right? You'd measure, like you said, you'd measure the just noticeable difference of a sound or something like that, right? And then with user experience, it's like we're looking at a wide variety of emotions and kind of saying like, well, why are some groups of people feeling these emotions when they enter a site or they touch this product or they drive this car for the first time or they try out this mapping system, and other people are struggling, and how do we categorize them, and how do we quickly wrap this up so we can move forward and build an amazing product, right? And the
Hmm.
thing about that is that it actually pushed us kind of. So tell me, like, what do you recall, D, of the time in which we realized, okay, we're gonna transition from doing only human factors, right? I
Hmm.
mean, to this day, we still do human factors, but like transitioning from only doing human factors into this new thing of like user experience. What was the first memory you remember of us trying to make that happen?
Well, I think it was actually kind of requested of us. From what I remember, the first project that we worked on was this kind of ethnography project with eBay.
Uh huh.
People don't remember that eBay was kind of at the forefront of this stuff. They had this massive usability lab, but they were also starting to dive into a lot of need finding stuff, a lot of ethnography, contextual interviews, that kind of stuff, moving beyond kind of the UI element of UX, because realistically, UI is a very small part of UX. Like, it's
Yes.
really about the most important part of UX is really a feature set, right? That's where design begins. Is like, what does this thing do? What are all the things that it does? Because if you can deliver one thing that somebody wants, but it doesn't have like the correct supporting features, and you're not delivering that in the right way. Like, can you imagine an ATM machine that can ATM machine an ATM that can give out money, but it can't tell you what your balance is?
Yeah.
Then you're kind of like in this incomplete, like, well, I don't know how much money I have left, so who knows, right? Those are all things that kind of need to play together. And human factors was still and still is important if you're, especially if you're designing something like uh, a hardware product. So that was a little bit of like, how big does it need to be to fit people's hands, the ergonomics aspect of things, how hard can they press, that kind of stuff. But for us, somebody came to us and said, "Hey, you're working on all these. You've got this deep research background. You've worked on all these things that are product related, that were associated with human factors. I need additional resources in order to kind of get this big project done with eBay. Why don't you help me out? Because you can bring academic rigor. I think more so even than the person who's coming to us. I don't think he was as deep in academics as we were,
Yeah.
and that can be kind of how things get started. So we helped out with that, and that turned into eventually more work with eBay. A lot of that ended up being kind of with usability and stuff. We did some more complex usability stuff like baselining and stuff like that. But it was kind of this thing where somebody came to us and said like, "Hey, we think you guys are a good fit for this," and we were like, "You know what? I think we actually are, because
Yeah.
we have deep knowledge in tech from just living and breathing in Silicon Valley our entire lives."
And for me, it was like a breath of fresh air to work with eBay because I'd
Hmm.
worked in tech before and it was during the 99 collapse. And so I had this 1 year, or less than a year of like just pure excitement of like 12-hour days, like living in the office, friends, like building a business, all this kind of stuff. Even though I was only doing a small part of it, it was exciting, and it kind of showed me what that world looks like a little bit. But it was kind of a breath of fresh air because it felt like they had a clear goal.
Yeah.
So it was like, hey, we want this interface to be better. At the time, I still do. I still use eBay, right? So like also
Hmm.
I had an opinion because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually kind of a user. So I have to be objective here and just like listen to these users come in and talk about the platform and what works and what doesn't for them. And then when we started doing the ethnography stuff, it really opened my eyes up into how people live. And that
Yeah.
really shocked me. Like being able to see people do things like sell product out of their homes and have big business. I mean, really big businesses selling product out of their house and what that life looked like. And it kind of opened my eyes to like the world. It was like, oh, wow, like you could do things many, many, many different ways. Meaning you can run small businesses, large businesses. It's going to look different for everybody else. And there's not a formula that says that you have to do it a specific way. There's some hacks along the way, and we're hoping to share some
Mhm.
of those with this. But like, well, you saw that. But was that before or after we did some freebies? Because you and I did some freebie usability testing with some startup companies in order to just kind of have a resume and kind of build out that side of our work.
I think that first project was before we started doing the freebies because they came to us. We did the work. We're like, oh, hey, this is actually kind of easier than a lot of the human factor stuff,
Yeah.
right? Because there's you don't have to have this level of like it was a little bit less concrete in a sense, which at the time because there was this was what 2004 or something like that. Like Facebook barely existed, Twitter didn't exist yet. There was just so much opportunity and so many unmet needs out there that you didn't have to fuss over like are you correctly measuring the force of that's being applied by a fingertip kind of thing like we
Yeah.
do for human factors. It was much more like what are they interested in, what are they excited by, what are their needs, like when somebody is going from a seller to a power seller, what does that mean for them? And we learned so much about just navigation and what it meant for a payment system and logistics management and all that stuff. We wanted to kind of work out our process and kind of get things ironed out ourselves so that when we were, collecting data, organizing data, putting together reports, we had things running smoothly. So we had friends who were coming out of Stanford and stuff like that, who had startups and things of a similar nature. And we would kind of do these little freebie things where we would do some usability examinations of their websites and stuff, like bring in a couple of users, a lot of times friends and family,
Yeah.
and they try to use their site, and we would point out to them like all the areas where they went. And I don't think any of those companies ever did anything, but it was a good way for us to kind of figure out where can we save a little bit of time here, a little bit of effort there, and make sure that our reports were readable and digestible to people. And it was a really important part of our kind of development as a company.
Yeah, it was actually still it was also the first time that I started feeling torn. And the reason is because I started wondering whether or not all the way back then, whether or not we were going down the right path because all these startups were coming out and they were building product, right? And they were trying to
Mhm.
sell their product. And I was thinking to myself, like, should we be building product? But the weird thing about that is that we are not engineers. We don't build product, nor did we have engineers around us that were interested in basically walking away from their corporate jobs and trying to build something that we didn't even have an idea what we would have built. But it was
Yeah.
strange because like being helping those startup companies, I started feeling that. But then as most of those disappeared, then I started
Mhm.
going, oh, wait a minute, we have a sustainable business based on like this highly defined need that people have. Maybe there's something good here. And so my emotions started going back and forth, but it started weighing more towards like, okay, we can make this work. And I'll tell you, there was a moment when I felt like we were kind of humming a little bit. So we had already worked with eBay, and then we were working with the military still, and we got called to go do a project, and we were in the desert. And we were in the desert with friends, so I was having the time of my life, obviously. And then I got an email. No, seriously, it was so fun. Like I miss those times. I have a big picture of all of us in the desert in the office here. Just I look at
Well,
it.
I'll add a little bit there's a little bit of kind of nostalgia and kind of reconstruction of that. And in the moment, it was like I remember somebody asking me like, "What was it like to work on tanks?" And I was like, "It's really cool for a day or two,
Yeah,
but then you have like 4 more months."
yeah. But I gotta say though, like the people though. I mean,
The people
what an
were
amazing.
most of them were great,
Yeah,
obviously. Like,
yeah. So it was cool in that sense, and I like that. But I was sitting inside of one of those portable units in the sandy desert, and I got an email, and it was from a design firm, and they were like, "Hey, your name was given to us by so and so. We need you to come in and help us work on a project." And it was like,
mhm.
wow, I'm like working on a project, just finished a project, and then now I'm getting an email about going to work on a project for someone I've never met before. And it was kind of like, oh, so this is how the business gets built.
Hmm.
and then I responded to that. And then there was another time, this is really funny, that I was on a hike by myself and I got a phone call from an unknown number. And I never usually pick those up, but for some reason I did because it was a 415 number. So I knew it was San Francisco. And I was like, maybe it's a friend or something. I'll pick it up. And I'm at the top of this hill and I'm like sweating. It was like 90 degrees out. And, uh, and I get a call and I pick it up and it's another design firm. And it was the owner of the design firm, very small firm. And he says to me, I need you to go do this project for me. Do you think it could be done in 3 days? And I was like, oh, God, 3 days. But it was small enough. And I knew that you'd probably say, like, yeah, we'll make it work, whatever. So I literally negotiated the cost and closed the deal while standing in the hot sun on top of a mountain as I was like hiking, on a random like work day. Like that's the
Yeah.
thing about owning your own business. You need some exercise. You just go out for a hike. I mean, no one's going to tell you where you can and can't be, right? And I closed that deal, and I was like, I just closed a deal while hiking. Like this is so weird. Like it was the beginning of feeling like the business had legs.
Yeah. It was an interesting time. I feel like so we started off, we were working with military stuff. We were working on vehicle systems, safety systems, medical systems. And I remember after eBay, and well, I mean, eBay was continuous for a while. And one of the ways that these things go is that the people who worked at a certain place become kind of your contact and your people in,
Yep.
and then they will leave that place and go somewhere else. And that's just kind of how professions work these days. Is that you're usually around somewhere for around 4 years, and then you go somewhere else. Somebody that we had worked with, I want to say at eBay, knew somebody at Microsoft,
Yep.
and Microsoft needed help with some stuff. So they asked, that person, who do you know that's good, that is reliable, that can get this stuff done? And they recommended us. And next thing you know, and Microsoft, I think they still have this facility. I'm not sure, actually. I think they might have sold it, but it was in Mountain View, so it was right next to us. And they were like, "Oh yeah, come in. We need some help with stuff." And that started like years and years of us working with Microsoft, and that was our second tech client, if I remember.
It was. And one of the things that I want to say is the devil's in the details.
Hmm.
And the reality was, it's not as simple as it sounds to just bounce from one big tech company to the other. And the reason why I say that is that it's all good intentions when someone calls and says, "Can you work on a project?" But from a corporate perspective, we didn't have a master service agreement. We didn't have a business agreement. W- when you get invited, so the eBay project was actually closed with a partnering company because we were asked to
Yeah.
come help, right? So we just come in and we help and we get paid. When Microsoft came, it was like, oh, we need you, your company, to come and help us do this thing. And we were like, okay, great, no problem. That's what I said. Oh, no problem. And then the paperwork came. And the reality is that when that actually happens, that's the kind of the beginning of building the business for the long term, because those companies require you to have what's called a master service agreement. And that means you have to have a certain amount of insurance and you have to have a certain amount of revenue. And like, there's like all
Hmm.
these requirements. And then you have to have a sponsor. So if you're lucky enough to have someone who really wants you there, they'll sponsor you. And once you have a master service agreement, you can do as many projects as you want with the company. And they just simply invoice them and they pay you. It's that simple. But
Yeah.
getting the actual agreement took some stuff because we didn't even have the insurance requirements. So like they had required something like, I don't know, $2 million of this and that. And you have to go and call your insurance company and basically set all this stuff up and like do all these things just to be able to do the project. And so I was grateful that the person who brought us in was okay with going on that little painful journey of like getting the paperwork done, because they probably could have just tried to find someone else to make it quicker, but they didn't. And
Hmm.
because of that, we were able to stay on as a Microsoft customer. And to this day, I still get emails. We don't work with them very often, but I got an email from them saying, "Oh, we're updating this or that. Make sure you update your portal." Or, we're still in this system.
Yeah, it's one of the things is that in order to get in an MSA with one of these companies and get on as an approved vendor, you have to be in the situation where they need someone to do something for a specific project. You can't really get an MSA and just be like, all right, well, when the need comes up, we'll let you know. It's at the point where they actually have a need. They have a project for something that they need to work on, and they can't. It will be like the company will require them to show that they can't go to another already existing approved vendor because they want to they're trying to keep down the number of vendors they have on their paperwork. So the stars kind of have to align where they have the need that none of their other vendors can do it. Maybe they're all, tied up or anything, something like that, or they turned it down or whatever. And that's the point where somebody who's willing to vouch for you and be your sponsor can put through the paperwork to get the MSA done. And usually the hard part is the MSA and the SOW can take longer to go through the process than they have time before the project needs to start. So that's when you end up in this kind of hairy situation where like, I need to figure out how to get the project up and running while they're still kind of sparring with legal in order to get everything kind of hashed out.
Yeah, it's quite a journey. I mean, it makes you realize how important the business side of things are as well as the work itself, right? Like if you
Mhm.
don't have that stuff lined up, it just doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
And the cool thing about Microsoft is that, well, a cool thing about all of them is that we have built friendships with these people that still last today. I mean,
Yeah.
you still are in contact with one of our original friends from Microsoft, and that was
Mhm.
our first contract with them. I think was in 2007, right?
Yeah.
So it's like that's a long time ago, and that's so fantastic and interesting. And the other thing I wanted to ask you was, did you have any idea like what you were getting into? Like, did you know what your lifestyle was going to end up like by running a business versus taking a job opportunity that was presented to you at the time?
No, I had no idea. It was one of those things where it was just like, all right, well, let's see where this leads and see what happens. I mean, we're talking about like when we were very first starting the business. When we were very first starting the business, I was like, all right, well, we're looking at layoffs at NASA because of the budget changes. And a lot of, not just us, but a lot of people were going off into the world. I wasn't sure where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. So I was like,
Hmm.
all right, well, let's see what this is. And if I change my mind, I change my mind. I think when we started getting into tech and doing that work, I was very, very interested in that work. I still am. I was just like understanding what people want, trying to solve problems, meet needs, providing them solutions that had never existed before was super fascinating. And again, still is. It seems like it's more rare these days that we come across a truly unmet need
Yeah.
as opposed to a poorly met need. But it's always exciting when it's like, you know what, there's nobody who's answering this problem. And us working with this company or even on our own can help to do this. It's to me, it's really inspiring. And that was the point where when we started working with eBay to some extent, and I think more so with Microsoft, that I was just like, all right, well, this is an avenue to do something that could be really cool. And, in between that, we're going to work on some stuff that's like kind of boring. That still happens sometimes, but it provides opportunities to work on stuff that is just unmatched, I
So
think.
you kind of glossed over that. So why is it that we had to work on boring projects in addition to the ones that we thought were super interesting?
Because sometimes things are boring. Sometimes you're looking at like some deep implementation of some feature that very few people are ever going to use, and you're looking specifically at like the interface behind it as opposed to kind of the overarching design of it. Sometimes you're doing things that are very like very confirmatory, like, oh hey, we just want to validate this kind of very small design decision that we made and make sure
Yeah.
it's not making things worse.
Well,
uh, and that sometimes it's like you look at it and you're like, yeah, I already know what's going to happen. We'll go out there and find what you want. What you want. We always look for ways to kind of make it a little bit more interesting. Like look at ways in order to like maybe there's a new way to market something, a new way to talk about something. Maybe there's some new feature that they didn't think about that somebody mentions during a session or something. There's always ways to try to spice it up. But sometimes, sometimes some projects are just not super interesting, and that comes
yeah.
down to sometimes the product isn't super interesting. But it needs to exist. There's plenty of uninteresting products out there that are just needed.
Yeah, and I would say to some extent I've noticed that financially the there's actually more financial opportunity in the very boring stuff, quote unquote boring stuff, because it needs to
Hmm.
work. It needs to work really well. Like people will tolerate more in those spaces because they need it so bad. So they want to try to make it as smooth as possible because it's something that people, a core opportunity people need. It could be like a SaaS product or something like that,
Hmm.
but I'm just curious from your perspective though, at this time, let's say it's roughly 2007 and we've had, a few companies underneath our belt. What are you thinking at that time when it comes to the business? Are you nervous, scared, opportunistic, excited, everything mixed up? Like, where are you in your head when we land, let's say we Microsoft and eBay, and we have our government contracts and that kind of stuff, and we're kind of humming in that perspective?
So right around that time, 2007, I'm not sure if you remember that this is when this happened, but that's when we first started working on streaming media. Uh,
Yeah, was it that early?
yeah, it was around 2007. We started working on some like streaming media, kind of ethnography, home visits, and things like that to determine like what was going on with home theater PC users at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
So if
yeah.
you're not familiar, if for listeners, if you're not familiar with the home theater PC movement, at the time there were people who would build out actual computer systems, and they might take a Mac Mini or some kind of a Windows Tower or a Linux box or something, and plug it into their TV with HDMI and use that with like you'd sit on their couch with a mouse and keyboard, a wireless mouse and keyboard, and like play video that they had downloaded and saved on their computer from like maybe LimeWire or Kazaa or something else, or even some
Yeah.
live like soccer feeds from Europe or something. And I went out. I think you were working on some gaming stuff at the time, but
Yep.
I went out and we got split up because we were working on separate projects, which is not usually how we like to work, but it
No,
sometimes
it
we
doesn't
have
really
to.
work very well, but we had to do it, so we did it.
Yeah, and we kind of got to understand what people wanted from a media experience, and it was not owning discs. It was not having a giant collection of DVDs as much. It was just having access to the content they wanted when they wanted it, and that's kind of what led to the streaming landscape now, where it's at the point where the directors and actors have, or not the directors, the writers and actors are both on strike because of the way that people have kind of taken advantage of this on the corporate level. But we came to understand, I think, that there was a ton of opportunity and a change in way in which media in general was going to be delivered. We kind of already seen it with music. So there was an exciting time, and I could see it happening with gaming also. We'd already been working on TV and media stuff for years before that, so it was kind of like we were pretty familiar with it. YouTube was picking up. I think Netflix was becoming like the first company out there to kind of distribute produced content through streaming services, and everybody
Yeah.
was. I think tons of people were skeptical. Everybody was like, I think the term cord cutter had just kind of come into existence, and all these people like at HBO and stuff were saying how it was no threat to them. Uh, Things were changing, and it was exciting. It was a time in which I felt that we could be a part of this big change in society.
Yeah, it was actually the first time that I realized that researchers were kind of like fortune tellers in a weird way. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's literally the example I give to everybody when we talk about the original streaming stuff you and I were involved in. More you than me, but I got involved obviously to some extent. And like just we were able to see around the corner by a decade.
Oh
Like
yeah,
like like we did this and we couldn't tell anyone about it, right? So it was like completely
yeah.
secret at the time, right? And then we were just looking at each other going like, wow, like this is the future. Now, a lot of people didn't believe us. That's fine. They were like, oh, this isn't going to happen. And you and I were like, oh, this is too easy to not be the future.
Oh
Right?
yeah, we were telling people like this is how people want to consume content. This is what they want to do with their TVs. But this
Mhm.
is what they don't want to do on their TVs.
Yeah.
They don't because at the time people were thinking like, oh well, we'll use like a computer monitor and people can put their Excel spreadsheets on their TVs and then have this giant. And then we were just like, no, people don't want to do that. People don't want to put their Facebook feeds up on their TV, that kind of stuff. uh, TVs are more of a social experience. They're more fun. They're these kinds of things. And I remember, and these are the form factors, and these are the controls, and these are the GUIs and things that people want. And we definitely got pushback. I remember the
Yeah.
same thing happened when we went out and did a bunch of research, and we found that people want true wireless earbuds.
Yeah.
Back before they existed, we went out and we did the research, and we told our clients like this is what they want, and they were like, maybe we'll see. And they slept on it, and now we have the AirPods, who have more revenue than the GDP of some nations.
Yeah, no, it's true. You get a chance to see around the corner, and I think I tell people this today. Like I sometimes say it jokingly, but I'm actually quite serious, which is that I believe that every company should have a UX person on their board, and I believe that every CEO should be talking with their UX person because it's the only person that has a direct pipeline into the ear of
Mhm.
the customer, into the mouth of the customer. The customer's saying like what's working and not working. They're not telling you what to build or do, but they're just saying where their problems are. They're saying where their needs are. And if you avoid that conversation, you're basically avoiding the opportunity to see around the corner.
Yeah, I've been advocating for a while that every executive, from the CEO to the COO to the CFO on down, should be a part of at least one UX research study a year. Maybe they shouldn't run it, but like show up to, observe a few interviews, maybe get involved in like discussions about the findings and stuff, just to kind of get in touch with what is going on kind of at the consumer level, at the customer level, and what do they
Yeah.
really think and need. Because I think one of the big problems they run into is a lot of the people who are making these decisions are really kind of disconnected from their actual customer.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me ask you a question. So, at this time, you were doing this kind of very fascinating research. There was some frustrating things that happened in this, we can't
Oh
talk
yeah.
about, but little issues that always run up when working with executives and presenting data and things like that. We learned it's all lessons, right? We learned from it and stuff. Did you ever feel like you wanted to bail from the business and go work with one of these streaming companies because you felt like you saw that there was a great opportunity ahead?
No, well, here's the thing: is I didn't think that anybody was really doing it right, and I
Yeah.
still kind of feel that. We're in strike situation, multiple strikes, and a lot of these companies have kind of their stock price down, if not their revenue down, including Netflix, who like had this whole thing where they reported fairly positive earnings, but their stock kind of still took a dive because I don't think anybody's really buying into it. So it was just a lot of times I look at what is going on within companies and it seems like it would just be extra frustrating because that's one of the things I think when you have data that gives you some insight, but a lot of the decisions don't necessarily reflect what that data is.
Uh huh.
It's certainly quite frustrating.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember at that time thinking to myself, like, why don't executives in most cases listen to what's coming from this angle, right? Like,
Mhm.
I we had a few that were fantastic, right? Big companies where they're just like dialed in, as you can tell, Microsoft's very dialed in, right? They listen to their customer quite well. But like other smaller companies really struggling to like consume it. And I think a part of it is ego, part of it is a lot of different things that you and I have talked about on the podcast before of just like beginner's mind, right? Like just take a deep breath and say, okay, what's really happening with this business? What's going on? What are customers asking for? And let's double down on that. But I actually have another question regarding the business. So where are you at this time in regard to like our opportunities ahead of us? Because I remember thinking to myself, I started to have some anxiety. I was like, okay, so we're landing multiple projects within a single company. That's awesome. That's great. So Microsoft brings you into one project, two project, three projects, eBay, that kind of stuff. And then some of the people left the company and they went to
Mhm.
other companies, and those other companies didn't need research. And then I was like, oh my gosh, now I got to find the person at the existing company that I could talk to and influence them to listen to me and see the work that we've done so that we can have the opportunity to bid on other projects that were coming up. I started to really see the challenge of the business side of it, of like trying to keep everything moving, but also still providing literally top tier support. I mean, like one thing I will point out about us is that when it comes to, I have zero regrets with any project we ever did from the history of this business, because every time we would say, well, what else can we give them? What else can we give them? What else can we give them? We were always doubling and tripling down on the amount of results, anything we can do to help them succeed. And I think they always appreciated that and probably helped with our success of continuing to get new customers. But my point is like at that time, I was starting to really see the monster of the business side, which is I have to kind of keep this engine moving, but at the same time, you can't force it. So did you feel that pressure? Like, I mean, we didn't have a lot of responsibilities back then. I mean, you and I lived together with a friend, and we were just working. That's it, just hanging out and working. So it didn't seem like I had a lot of stuff that needed to be, taken care of, so to speak.
I kind of got lost in your question, but I'll speak to kind of
Yeah,
like
yeah.
what we were looking for at the time. That's not necessarily what we're looking for now. At the time, we wanted to work with as many people as we could. We wanted to go as broad as we could. We wanted to get as much experience as we had a lot of confidence in our abilities to perform the research and perform the work, and
Yep.
also to kind of relate that to how design decisions could be made, how marketing decisions could be made, how kind of product strategy can be related, because we had a very strong knowledge of users and customers, and we as you do these, you just keep building on it. Like you, every time you go out there and you talk to new people, you build on your existing knowledge, and the same people who are buying things on an e-commerce site like Alibaba or eBay or Amazon are the same people who are watching movies on Apple TV Plus or whatever it's called these days, or Netflix. So they're the same people. There's different contexts.
Mm.
Um, we wanted to have as many contexts as we could at the time, work with as many different companies as we could at the time, kind of build out our Rolodex, build out our resume as far as what kind of research that we had done. Because at a certain level, people are people, and the research is research, and we had enough of a kind of grounding in the fundamentals that somebody could come to us, and people did sometimes, and say like, "Hey, we need to figure out this question,
Yep.
uh, and we don't know how to get it answered." None of the kind of known and normally used methodologies are really going to work for this. What can you do for us? And we would create a new methodology. Sometimes it would be something that was like like woven together from scratch based on research fundamentals. Sometimes it was this multi-methods approach that stitched together a variety of different things that included maybe some qual, maybe some quant, maybe some of this and that, until we can get to forming the answer. But that was kind of our whole point. We were very focused on kind of professional development for ourselves as well as building the company.
Yeah, one of the things I always appreciated about you was that you never ever wanted to give anything less than 100% to every customer. Like
Oh yeah, of
even
course.
when the customer, well, you say of course, but I think that there's a lot of people out there that get tired. We would get tired, you know what I mean, and just kind of be
Mhm.
like, okay, we don't need to add one extra slide and give them our wonderful great ideas at the age of 26, right? But you would say like, no, no, there's something here. Like we should give this to them, and it's like, cool, okay, let's talk about it, and we spend an extra hour, kind of, figuring out the right way to say it or the right way to present it, to make sure that they got the best quality work. And I think that's a testament to today, because it's like, here we are 18 years later, and we are with some of the same customers. And that
Yeah.
is a testament, honestly, to a lot of things, but I think a big part of it is to how you don't want to give anything less than 100% for every single finding.
Well, I think what it comes down to is that I think it matters a lot. We cared quite a bit about the data that we're providing, the findings that the data, the findings, the recommendations were all correct and accurate. Like we never want to be in a situation where like we're putting out data that turned out to be wrong, or we're making recommendations that turned out to be wrong. Now, the the way this always works is that, and the way it should work, is that we provide the data, they make the decisions.
Yep.
So they understand their business, they understand their strategies, they understand their context more than we ever will, because they are the company and we are a resource. So we will tell them like, all right, you do this, this, and this, and this is likely to happen. This is what the data is telling us. And sometimes we'll end up in a situation where people will say, like, often, right? Well, that decision is already made. So our role then shifts to, all right, well, how are people going to react to that? And if there are points where they're not happy about it, what can be done given that this can't change? Is there something that can be done in order to mitigate any negative reaction, or shift that negative to a positive, even if that product decision isn't changed?
Yeah.
So it was for me, and I imagine for you also, it was just always about making sure that we were putting out was correct and
Yes.
accurate, and making sure that we weren't ever going to contribute to misunderstandings and things like that. More than just providing, that uh, that value to the customer, it was really about looking after the user and making sure, because sometimes we were the user, right?
Yeah,
Sometimes
absolutely.
it's something we're going to use ourselves, and it was like, oh, I don't want to have to deal with this like poorly designed thing or something that's missing this important feature. I want to have a certain experience with the products that I use. And I want the other people that I care about to have the experiences that they want to have with the products that they use. And I want to be able to kind of know that maybe I contributed to that. So that's where kind of that work ethic comes in, is just making sure that, we will always tell them like, all right, well, these are things we know. These are things we think. These are things we suspect. And use those where appropriate. Don't overcommit to something that we think is just a maybe. Um, but it was more important to tell them that there were some gaps in the knowledge than it was for us to kind of propose something that they would take as true when we thought it was possible.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is that whole idea that like, you could test 10 people on something, and let's say 8 out of 10 of them liked X number of features, and you can present that as just data. You can say, oh, 8 out of 10 people loved this feature, and this feature. The difference between us and that approach is that what does that mean? That's our
Yes.
thing. Well, what does that actually mean? And it doesn't necessarily mean you do what they say. It means that this particular trend is occurring, sentiment is present, whatever that is. And how do you translate that into a business goal and taking action? And, it took a while to get there, to be honest, right? Like when you're
Mm-hmm.
working with a research department, a lot of times they want to make that presentation to the larger stakeholders. And sometimes when we're presenting to product managers or we're presenting to C-level executives like we do now, we try to boil all that into what does this actually mean and how do you take action with it. And
Mm-hmm.
that took time to learn. I mean, I feel like we kind of did it in the beginning, but ultimately, like, it was over time you get better and better at it. But I want to point out something though, is that while we're doing this at this time, um, something is kind of boiling in the background. And the thing that was boiling in the background was that we wanted even more clients, and we had kind of exhausted our friend network. So our friend network was amazing. And I give props to all of our friends. They literally got us off the ground. I mean, they would introduce us to people at their companies. They would help us when we asked. They would come in if they fit the criteria really strictly. We would allow them to be users if we weren't running them sometimes. Like we did a lot. They did a lot for us to help us get to where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but there was a point where it was boiling out. But there was this new service that was emerging, and it was called LinkedIn. And I remember we were living together, and I said, D, I want to get more clients. We got to meet new customers, new businesses, all this kind of stuff. And we were trying different avenues. We weren't really like getting there. And then I started doing this thing where I purchased LinkedIn as a I think it's called like a pro account or something. And I started sending out these simple messages. We do this, and we've worked with these customers. Let me know if you want to have a chat. And I sent out like maybe 50 or 60 of them in one day, like just literally spent the entire day writing these out. And I clicked send and sent them all out. And it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I drove back to the house. You were there. I walked in and we chatted for a little bit. And then I walked up, turned on my computer, and I had 8 messages from 8 different companies saying they wanted to have a conversation with us. And
Mm-hmm.
that was like the biggest aha moment, that our strategy of being able to keep this business going for a long time, having new customers, having interesting adventures, was going to require us to grow beyond the friend network and the network we built within our community, and to start using some of the tools that were available out there. Now, I have to say, if you try to do that today, I think your hit rate would be a lot lower, because now everybody does that on LinkedIn, so no one ever wants to respond back to you. But
Mm-hmm.
but at the time, it worked, and that's how we ended up with some of the customers that even interact with us today.
Yeah, very much so. I
Yeah,
mean, and one of the great things about LinkedIn then, and still today, is a little bit less so. It's a little diluted today,
yeah,
but it was easier to make use of that friend network in a certain way, because that friend who introduced you to one company, you might not realize, oh, hey, they've got a good friend over at this other company.
Yep.
Maybe I can say like, oh, hey, we both know so and so. Let's connect, and that could be the beginning. Now, it usually doesn't directly lead to a sale. What that does is it leads to the expansion of your professional network, and
Hmm.
over time, could be 6 months, could be a year, could be 2 years, could be 6 years. That could turn into a new client.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing is you have to be able to bet on the long game. And betting on the long game is very scary because you're like, well, is this going to work out? Are they going to call me? I mean, how many times we got called by someone? They're like, we used to work together on this project 5 years ago, and friend said you're great. And we're like, dude, that's cool. And then suddenly we have a conversation, and it all comes together. And this was back in the day when we would go to the actual companies and sit there and talk to them about what we do. Right?
Yeah,
Nobody brings us in anymore to have a conversation. Right? And this was way before the pandemic. It turned
yeah,
into, hey, get on, first it was Skype, right? Get on Skype and just have a call with us and have a conversation. And then from Skype, it went to other services, but like GoToMeeting, that was it. And so
yeah. Oh man,
we
go to
we
meeting.
we started using GoToMeeting and connecting, and it made us realize something. But this was something interesting that happened at the time, and I want to point this out for anyone who's starting a consulting business or thinking about it. Is that we had a couple clients that really loved us, and they were paying us to do tons of work with them. And they got to a point where they were like, "Well, we want you here X number of days per week," meaning that they want us like sitting in their desk. Now, Dee and I had just got our first office, had no windows in it or anything. It was very tiny. And I had this idea. I was like, no, we need to actually have a physical office where we could do testing out of our office. So if the client
Hmm.
wants to be blind to it, like blind to the research, then we have this whole new service offering because they could be like, oh, well, we don't want it being done here, let's say at Microsoft, right? We want it to be done by you. We don't want Microsoft mentioned. We just want this to be private. And we just want to kind of see what happens when they're presented with different, options of product, right? And so they were kind of asking us to come in. Now, that was when I really learned the difference between having a studio or what you would call a firm versus being a contractor, because the terms were all thrown around different ways, but they were using the word contractor and saying, "Oh, can you please be in the seat?" And we had to go say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we run our own firm, and so if you want to work with us, you can come to our office. But we don't sit here all day long because we have other clients that we support at the time." It was a battle because I
Yeah,
had to like really make the case for why this was being done. And I had a couple friends that ran design studios, and I talked to them, and they're like, "Oh, it's a battle. Like you have to make sure you're very clear with them because you are not a staffing company. You
yeah.
are a firm that thinks strategically and big about their problems and helps them solve their product problems." And so I remember kind of like noodling over that and trying to figure that out and how we were going to balance it all. Because ultimately, like if we weren't there like 3 days a week, did that mean they'd rather go with another company?
Yeah, I felt as though there was only one relationship I thought, and that was GoPro. We're actually going in and spending and working as though we were an employee at a desk really worked out. Every other time, it felt like it was, people recognized that you were going to be there temporarily, so it didn't really help that much as far as like building working relationships and connections, as opposed to kind of working as a firm and kind of interacting with people that way.
Yeah.
If anything, it just kind of like took us away from other things that we needed to do that was important to the company. So that was developing new relationships, working on things the way they were, and being on site usually. And people are finding this now that there's so much more work from home. There were just so much more distractions. People would come by and chat and stuff like that, which is great. But because they knew they treated you like you were just a temp as opposed to an expert in the field, which we were, then it almost never turned into a longer, more meaningful relationship. So it just ended up kind of keeping you from getting the work done and
Yeah.
getting the work done at the highest level that you could.
Yeah, and GoPro was different because it was a hardware product. So like I kind of wanted to be there as much as I possibly could, because I was actually trying to figure things out regarding the hardware product, right? And so it's like I'm
Mhm.
holding it, I'm touching it, I'm talking to engineers, and it kind of made sense, like you said. It was awesome in that, and it was one of the most fun I've ever had working with a company. Honestly, like it was,
It was
it was
also just a special group of people too.
very special group of people, very cool, very mission driven people that just to this day we're friends with them, and I sometimes miss them, right? And that was a long time ago. It's like it's just an interesting how these relationships get built. And you hear VCs say all the time, "I don't invest in a product, I invest into teams," and I kind of get it now to some extent. Like
Sure.
you have a good team, and it's like almost like magic can happen. But so at this time, I'm going to summarize kind of what we talked about today. So we basically got this business off the ground. Our friends and family helped us. We lived together. We had low responsibilities. We, most importantly, just provided phenomenal extra work for every client we worked with who referred us to other clients. We started learning about the business. We started learning about how to think. And no, we were not making as much as an engineer that went to Google or other things, but we were on a journey, and the journey was interesting and crazy and fun. And like to this day, I think back of all these moments and all these wonderful people we met. But this was still only around 2007, and it was already getting crazy, and we were already doing some interesting things. And I want to leave this episode with what we're going to talk about in the beginning of the next episode, which is 2008 comes, President Obama wins the election, and there's a huge financial collapse. And Lehman Brothers went under, and suddenly the Great Recession begins, and everything starts to fall apart. And Dee and I are like, okay, we just got a new office at the time. We're sharing it with a real estate agent because it saved us some money, and he wasn't there 3 days a week. And we were like, what do we do? And so let's leave it at that. And you and I can start the next episode, part 2, with what happened in 2008, 2009, and with us personally and with the business, and how did we kind of pull out of it. So with that said, everyone, thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. Follow us, leave comments, tell us how you built your business. Like, we want to learn from everything that you have done. And we will see you all next week, and also with part 2. Thanks.